guys, Mr. Klein here with our first lesson in our next chapter on the later Middle Ages. We're going to cover the Crusades today, along with the Spanish Reconquista. And our other lessons in our chapter will include the medieval church in the later Middle Ages, up to and including the Black Death. So let's go ahead and let's get diving in. Now, before we get into the Crusades, we needed to talk about something I did not talk about yet. And that was the spread of Islam in Europe, which centers here in Spain, that by the late 700s, early 800s, Islamic invaders called the Moors had pushed into Spain. And this led to a 700-year-long push, what we call the Reconquista, specifically 500 years in particular from around the year 1000 to 1492, where Christian kings and nobles of Spain fought against the Moorish Islamic invaders who had taken over Spain. And over the course of time, a lot of brutal warfare happened between both sides, but the Christians simply were finally able to push them out slowly but surely up until 1492. Two people of interest that I want you guys to know about are national heroes of both Spain and Portugal. Portugal being this little country right here, the rest of this being Spain. The Spanish hero is what we call El Cid, the Lord. He was a Spanish nobleman in the late 1000s, early 1100s, who led Christians in attacking the Muslim invaders and became a national hero of Spain. And even now, he's considered one of the great heroes of Spanish culture and stuff like that, which there were comic books, as you can see in this picture. The Portuguese hero was Gerald the Fearless, who was similar to El Cid in that he fought against Muslim invaders, and under his command, there was a particular city in Portugal could never be conquered by the Muslims. His base of operations was never conquered by the Muslims despite their biggest efforts, and he's considered one of the national heroes of Portugal also. And interestingly enough, the Muslims were finally kicked out of Spain in the year 1492. Yes, the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. When they finally surrendered the city of Granada in 1492. And these two people right here, the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, yes, those people you do know. That's the King and Queen of Spain who sent Christopher Columbus later that year to explore new routes to India, and in the process rediscovered the New World. So, the conflict between Christians and Muslims was not an old thing whenever the Crusades rolled around. And so let's get into this. The Crusades were a long series of wars over the course of about 200 years between Christians and Muslims in Southwest Asia. On the surface, the Crusades were a holy war, a war of religion between Christians and Muslims. But once we look under the surface, and especially at the end whenever we look at the outcome of the Crusades, you'll see that there were a lot of political and non-religious things going on that the Crusades got started with and were results of. Now, the Europeans fought the Muslims in an area we call Palestine, which was what we considered the Middle East, and the area that the Christians called the Holy Land, in particular Israel, and it was very important to Christians because, after all, that's where Jesus lived. Before the Crusades, Muslim rulers had taken over this area pretty early, and this is Palestine and the area where the Crusades took place right here. It's the modern-day countries of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and to a lesser extent, Egypt. And before this time, the Muslims had taken over Jerusalem, but because Christians were considered people of the book, they didn't really bother Christians who would come and would worship in shrines and places like that in Israel. However, in the 1200s, a new group of Muslims, we call Turkish, they actually didn't come from Turkey, but rather they came from here in Central Asia and had moved in over the course of a couple hundred years, had taken over the Holy Land. And reports came back to the kings of Europe and the Pope that the Turks began attacking them because they were Christians. And the Pope wasn't going to have any of this, because he wasn't going to have his faithful parishioners being attacked by Christians. In addition, his Christian brothers, whom he had just split off in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Empire was calling for help because even though they were Eastern Orthodox, the Pope considered them Christians, and the Turkish Muslims were actually attacking the Byzantine Empire. Also, looking for a place to gain more money, the Pope put together a series of things he called indulgences where people could give offering to the church to help fund these military crusades, and in response he said that they could go to heaven and not spend so much time in purgatory. And so the Pope called for these Christians to take the Holy Land, and crusaders from all over Europe, nobles, knights, soldiers, even peasants, gathered in France to go and fight against these evil Muslims. Along the way, crusaders, which they were kind of pushed by zeal of Christianity, but the vast majority of these people were completely and totally uneducated. They only heard about the Crusades and the problems that were happening in the Holy Land through their local priests in the Catholic Church, and they had no way of knowing otherwise. Among the things they did were really crazy and not very intelligent things, such as kill Jews along the way. They would find communities of Jews and slaughter them wholesale for the crime of they were a part of the same ethnic group that killed Jesus. And, you know, if you killed Jesus, the founder of Christianity, you were obviously evil. So not exactly passing along the teachings of Christianity real well. When the peasants pushed ahead of the soldiers who had told them not to do so, they got to the Holy Land, and they were promptly ambushed and defeated and killed by the professional Turkish army, who didn't see them as much of a threat, mainly because that these people essentially had no training. However, the European nobles and soldiers landed soon afterwards, defeated the Turks, and set up 4 kingdoms there. And these kingdoms are the County of Tripoli, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. And these kingdoms brought European-style feudalism with them to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was free from the Muslim conquest and the Muslim menace. And everyone shouted, hooray. But, as we can see right here with the Crusaders taking Jerusalem in 1099, this was pretty much the high point of the Crusades, the very first one, out of about 9 of them. Within 50 years, the Muslims started taking back land from the Christians. In response, the Christians, under the tutelage of the Pope, launched even more crusades against them. But these invasions ended in defeat, and slowly but surely, the Turkish and Muslim armies started taking these one by one. In particular, there was a lot of fighting over Jerusalem, whom the Muslims considered to be holy as well. The most famous of these crusades, and depending on your count, there's 8 or 9 official ones, and then there's plenty more smaller ones, which were smaller military expeditions. The biggest one was the Third Crusade, the Crusade of Kings, if you will, where German, French, and English kings fought against the Muslims. The most famous 2 fighters in the Third Crusade, one was Christian and one was Muslim, was King Richard I of England. He was King Richard the Lion-Hearted. He got that name for his bravery and fighting against the Muslims. And his counterpart was the Turkish general Saladin. And Saladin, both of these were revered for their heroism and chivalry and honor in battle. That even though he was considered to be a Muslim, he was given great honor and great respect by the Christians because of the way he treated knights and things like that. However, Richard the Lion-Hearted was in no way shy from killing lots and lots of Muslims and slaughtering them wholesale. Saladin didn't have any problem slaughtering Christians wholesale. Thus, these concepts of honor and bravery and things like that tend to be a little glossing over of the history. So, by the year 1291, or about 200 years after the First Crusaders managed to take Jerusalem for the first time, the Muslims had taken back all of Palestine, and all of these 4 kingdoms by the Crusaders were gone, and thus the Crusades ended. The Crusades also led to the death of some kings, like, for example, the death of Frederick of Germany, who was a member of a crusade, and he was killed in battle by Muslim invaders. So, leading to a lot of changes in Europe. So, how did the Crusades change Europe? Well, before this time, Europe was pretty much locked into its own world run by the Catholic Church, and that nobody made any contact outside of Europe without the Church. There was some trade, but overall your average European had no education at all, never left their manor house because 90% of them were peasants, and the kings were just as ignorant as their subjects they ruled over, with the only people having any sort of education being your local priests or members of the church, and mainly what they had was just Christian teachings. The Crusades increased trade between Europe and Asia because people who'd gone in the Crusades, because servants and stuff were peasants also, so they went, in addition to nobles and kings, came back with taste for things in Europe that in Asia that they didn't have previously, which led to a demand for Asian things. Europeans had stuff that the Asians wanted, and the Middle East, that led to trade between the two. In some cases, the Crusades increased the power of kings over nobles, and we'll talk about the relationship between the Catholic Church and kings in the next lesson. But in the summary, I'll go over some of the summaries of it. But essentially, the Crusades fundamentally changed the relationship between the church and kings in Europe. The Crusades were also very divisive. Jews didn't trust Christians because, after all, they were busy running around killing them on the way to go kill Muslims. Muslims saw the Christians as invaders, meddling in business that was not their own and trying to take land from them. And the Eastern Orthodox Christians saw the Western Christians as invaders because they sacked Constantinople themselves. So let's look at the overview of the Crusades right now. There were good and not so good results of the Crusades. First off, let's go with the good. Like I said, it increased contact with outside cultures and it allowed for increased sharing of knowledge. The Muslims had managed to save a lot of Roman and Greek writings and scientific information, and this slowly spread into Europe through Catholic churches through contact with Muslims. The increased contact, like I said, meant increased trade between Europe and Asia, which led to the growth of the economy in Europe and led to the downfall of the feudal system. Also, politically, it led to the decrease of the Catholic Church's authority over kingdoms. Kings started to not listen so much to the Pope as they did previously because they started getting their own ideas about government and they didn't like people meddling with them. Now, the not so good results of the Crusades was this. First off, the Crusades were the result of a church authority abusing its authority for political gain. The church knew that the attacks by the Turks weren't all rooted in reality, but they saw it as an advantage that they could use to gain control over Jerusalem for their own purposes. And so by getting the European armies to fight for them, they abused their establishment as being the voice of God and stuff like that in Europe for their own political gain. Like I said, through attacks on Jews and the Christians and Muslims fighting each other, and then the Eastern Orthodox Church being under siege, actually laid siege in the 1200s by Crusader Christians themselves, led to all of these groups distrusting each other. And we can actually see this through Islamic propaganda by some terrorist groups saying that they're just fighting against the infidel Christians set to fight the Crusades and things like that. So the result of the Crusades was not good, and we even feel it 700-800 years later. The increased power of kings over nobles. The kings would go off to fight in the Crusades, and they would come back seeing that nobles did things that abused their power, or the kings took power away from them. Or the nobles would go to war while the kings would sit back, and while the nobles were gone, the kings would take stuff from them, and since they weren't there, they couldn't do anything about it. And finally was the final decline of the Byzantine Empire. Like I said, the Crusaders would oftentimes pass through Constantinople on their way to fight Muslims here in Turkey, or they would get on ships and sail down to the Holy Land. And in the 1200s, Constantinople itself was actually sacked by Christians because they blamed the Eastern Orthodox people for actually killing Catholics. This sack of Constantinople and its burning down for a large portion of the city left the empire very, very weak and allowed the Turks, the Muslim Turks, to actually finally push in and over the final 200 years, conquer Constantinople, making all of Turkey is Muslim. So, there you go. That's the lesson. First off, we started with the Reconquista, which was the fight of the Christians in Spain to push out the Muslims. Their heroes for the Spanish were El Cid and Gerald the Fearless for the Portuguese. The Crusades were a long series of war between Christians and Muslims. The Pope said that the Muslims were harming Christians visiting Jerusalem and worshiping, and gathered up armies in order to defeat them. The peasants were initially defeated, but when the nobles showed up, they took Jerusalem in 1099, establishing 4 kingdoms of Christians, where the feudal system set up. However, shortly afterward, the Muslims started taking back within 50 years of the First Crusade being over, leading to more crusades, with the third one involving the Christian King of England, Sir Richard the Lionhearted, and Saladin, the Muslim general, both of whom fought in several bloody battles against each other, and they're both regarded as heroes. The Crusades changed Europe for good and not so good reasons. They increased contact with outside cultures and trade and decreased the Catholic Church's power over kingdoms. On the other hand, the Church did abuse its power Christian invaders and war crimes and attacks unprovoked against both sides caused distrust between all groups involved in the Crusades, and also it led to the death of the Byzantine Empire with the sacking of Constantinople. So there you go, that's your lesson. I know it was a bit long, but we had to cover 200 years of history pretty quickly. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.